So why do allele frequencies change? That's where we left off. So we're going to be going over what are called the 5 agents of evolutionary change. And if you look back in the notes here, you can see that there were those 5 conditions that had to be met in order for Hardy-Weinberg to work or stay in equilibrium. So what we're going to do is go through each of those 5 and talk about what can go wrong that would make a population go away from Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So the first thing has to do with population size not being large enough. And what can happen is called genetic drift. So what's going to happen is allele frequencies are going to jump really, really quickly and drastically. And that can happen in one of 2 ways. The first way is called founder effects. The second way is called bottlenecking. So we'll start out with founder effects. And I think it's easier if I kind of show you this picture. So let's say... Ooh, I didn't know I had that sweet animation. Let's say that we've got this population of, let's say this is all one species of butterfly, and let's say that these blue ones have some sort of genetic disorder of some type. And so obviously, if we tried to figure out what % of the population I'm showing you here has that defect, I'd say, I don't know, maybe 20%. Let's go with that. So let's say that this little subgroup that you see here decides to go off and start their own population somewhere else. Now, if we look at this, we can see that that genetic disorder has jumped up to 50%. So a founder effect is going to be something where you have this little pioneer population, they go off to try to start their own population, but there might be not a real great representation of the original population in that subgroup. Now, the good thing about founder effects, good and bad, first of all, most of these pioneer populations do end up dying off. However, if we look back, I don't know if I can go backwards, yes, if we look back here, even if this little population right here dies off, there's still the population over here that's going to be able to replace them or keep going. So the species isn't going to die out. Now, the other type of effect is a bottlenecking effect, and I didn't have time to make a new animation for this one, but actually we can use this slide again. Let's say that what happens is all of these guys outside the circle get killed off for some reason or another, and all you're left with is this little population. Now, once again, it has a high chance of dying off because of that defect, but then if we look, there's nothing else left because we've killed everything else, right? So that can happen due to natural things, but most of the time it's usually due to man-made things or hunting or overfishing or something like that. So it's a little bit more drastic to have a genetic bottleneck. Now, when we say genetic, another thing that's important to think about is if you look in this picture here, you can see that there's different shades of, cream and yellow and white and blue, and that's showing the genetic diversity of this original population. And let's say, once again, all these guys back here are getting killed off, and all that's left is going to be this little population. The diversity genetically has gone down. So we're really, really, really pushing genetic diversity and how important it is. And think about why you think it would be. One reason is because if we were all the same, let's say for right now there's a bad flu season, right? And if we were all the same genetically, one strain of the flu could wipe us all out, right? So same thing with genetic bottlenecking. They're having a huge problem with that with cheetahs. And what's happening is these cheetahs are all getting genetically bottlenecked because they were being hunted for their pelts. And then all of a sudden, we've found that they've become very genetically similar. So that's a huge problem. And so what they're doing is they're actually shipping in cheetahs from all over the world at all the zoos. And they're like paying all this money to fly them there and get them to mate with one another. Most of the time it works. Of course, you've got some times where they're like, I don't like her. Obviously, they'll do something to help that. But they're doing stuff for genetic bottlenecking. And some people say, should we really even do that? Another example is going to be the prairie chicken. I am sorry, this is the coolest chicken I've ever seen. I love these guys. Anyway, so really cool looking chicken. And in Illinois, this green area used to be where they're found. And due to agriculture and building, this is where they're found now, hardly anywhere. And so they're actually going through a bottleneck, and now they're shipping prairie chickens in to bolster their genetic diversity. So kind of crazy, the stuff that we do, right? So those are going to be both things that can happen if the population gets too small. Now, another thing that can happen is what's called non-random mating. And non-random mating is going to be where you have individuals that you can kind of predict are going to mate with certain individuals. And there's two types. There's assortative mating and there's disassortative mating. So assortative mating is going to be where you have phenotypically similar individuals mating, and that increases homozygous individuals. Okay, so let's use eye color as an example for this. And let's say you've got blue-eyed people only mating with blue-eyed people. That's phenotypically similar, right? So they're both little b mating with little b. So their offspring are all going to be little b. So you can see if that keeps happening, that's going to increase the amount of homozygous individuals in that population. I know we're using a lot of Bio 111 words. Okay, now disassortative mating is going to be where you have phenotypically different individuals. So let's say we've got a blue-eyed person and a brown-eyed person. Now if you have little b and you cross it with big B, you're going to have a lot of heterozygous offspring. And so disassortative mating is going to increase heterozygous individuals in the population. Okay, so ask me about that if that kind of confuses you. The next thing that can happen is mutation. And simply put, mutation is just going to be a random change in the sequence of your DNA. That can be due to pollution, that could be due to sunlight radiation, it could be due to a lot of things. And we love talking about mutation in classes because we think it's so cool, like X-Men. And, yes, sometimes things, get kind of crazy. But really, mutation doesn't happen that often. And it's got to usually happen with something else we're listing here to be an agent of evolutionary change. It usually doesn't get that crazy unless it's a seriously crazy situation. Okay, the next one is going to be gene flow, and gene flow is going to be where you have alleles from one population moving over to alleles of another population. So if you look here, this is the most hilarious drawing ever. Okay, so you've got white bunnies here. This is a river, and these are brown bunnies over here. And so what's going to happen is these are the same species, but if we've got this river here, these guys are going to keep mating with one another here, and there's no gene flow across because they can't cross the stream. So let's say due to global warming, that the river dissolves. What's going to happen is these are probably going to start to mate with one another. And so you're going to have this happen. Now, think about it. Do you think that that's going to make these two separate populations more similar, or are they going to become more distinct and more different from one another? Hopefully you said that they're going to become more similar, and that's because gene flow reduces differences because you've got a lot of mixing going around. Okay, so that's going to be gene flow. Terrible, terrible bunny rabbits, but I was panicking. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, then the last thing is going to be selection, and selection is simply put when you have some organisms leaving behind more progeny or offspring than others. And there's two types of selection. You can have artificial, which is where you have a breeder that's actually doing it, right, or farmer or something like that selecting for characteristics. And then you have natural selection, and that's where the environment is going to dictate who mates with who. Now, as far as selection goes, 3 conditions have to be met. First of all, there has to be variation, right? If everybody's the same, then nobody's going to have any sort of advantage over anybody else. The second part is that that variation has to result in differences in the number of offspring surviving the next generation. So that's great if you guys are all different, but if nobody's surviving any better than anybody else, then it doesn't really matter. So it has to result in some sort of advantage evolutionarily. And then the third thing is that it must be genetically inherited. So remember how we talked about things that acquire over your lifetime? That doesn't really mean anything. It has to be stuff that's genetically in your DNA. So there's going to be 3 types of selection that can happen in a population. So, and before we go there, these are just some questions. You can look through these on your own again, but these are very similar to questions I would ask on a test. And so read this and see what you think. You can pause it because I'm not going to wait the whole time for this. But what I'm asking you to do is to talk about or to choose which Hardy-Weinberg condition is being violated. So basically, you've got shorebirds that are hunting and are going to go after the light shelled organisms versus the dark ones. So what's happening in this population, or what's being violated in the Hardy-Weinberg? And you would say no selection, right? Because Hardy-Weinberg says no selection can happen, and what's happening is this predator is picking the light ones versus the dark ones. Here's another one, a species of goose, the snow goose and the blue goose, right? And what they've found is that white geese tend to mate with white geese and blue geese like to go with the blue ones. So what's being violated there? Hopefully you said random mating, right? That is non-random mating that's happening there. Okay, this is a very, very, very long one, but this is talking about blood types and how basically the frequency of one blood type has kind of changed as people are migrating from different areas. So you can pause this and read this, and then when you're done, hopefully you came up with gene flow, right? Because this is actually talking about gene flow happening. Okay. So now what we're going to get into are going to be the different types of selection that can happen. And so what we're showing you here in this top one is going to be just a regular bell curve of how selection or how a population usually looks. So you've got some rare phenotypes on the extremes here, and then the intermediate is more common. Okay, so these are little mice. So there's basically 3 ways that the population can change, and those are all the dotted lines that you see here. So in directional selection, what can happen is all of a sudden it's more common, where did my pointer go? It's more common for the dark phenotype to be there. And so what's happening is that bell curve is shifting to the right. It could also shift to the left. Okay, so when would this happen? Let's say global warming, right? And now there's no snow whatsoever, and so it's more favored to be darker than it is to be lighter. That would be how you would see that population evolve like that. Another way it can go is when the extremes are going to be favored. So let's say for some reason there's dark stones and there's a lot of snow, so it's favored to be the extremes, but it's not favored to be in the middle. Then what's going to happen is you'll see that peak in the valley and the peak again. And then the third type of selection is going to be what's called stabilizing selection, and that's going to be where for some reason there's a lot of trees with brown trunks, and so these guys blend in very well. And so what's going to happen is you'll see that bell curve kind of narrow. So those are the 3 types of selection, and that third one's called stabilizing. Okay, so these are some questions that can ask you about the different types of selection that can happen. So you have butterfly species that have 2 very different color patterns. What type of selection is it showing? So the answer to this one is going to be disruptive. So if we go back to, this slide, here's disruptive right here, right? Because they said 2 different colored patterns, very, very different, right? And so that means the extremes are being favored in that population. Okay, this next one is talking about a species of bird makes about 4 to 5 eggs in its clutch. Those producing fewer or more than this have reduced fitness. So basically, to be right in the middle is favored. So which one of those is it? You should have chosen stabilizing, because we go back to that slide, you can see that having 4 to 5 is good. Having 6 or more, not good. Having 3 or less, not good. And so it narrows that bell curve. Okay. Fossil evidence indicates that horses have gradually increased in size over geologic time. Which of the following best describes this? So they're getting bigger, so it's going in one direction, so it's shifting over, and that's going to be directional selection. Okay, so let's get back to the notes here and just finish up with sexual selection. So sexual selection is just talking about some sort of selection occurring from male to female. And that can result in what's called sexual dimorphism, which you saw in lab, and that was talking about how you can see a difference between male and female. So there's a couple of different types. You've got intrasexual selection, and that's when you have competition among individuals of one sex for mates of the opposite sex. So this is a lot of times you'll see like where you have one male with a bunch of females. So if we go back to here, this is the best picture ever. So you've got These giraffes here, this is a very good example of intrasexual selection. Look at that high kick right there. That's amazing. So what this is two males that are fighting over a harem of females. And so that definitely happens quite a bit. The other type, intersexual selection, is where you're going to have choosy mates. So one that's kind of like female, that's kind of choosy about which one she's going to pick. And what that leads to is competition. And, oh, sorry, that's another intrasexual selection example. This is intersexual selection. So when you have a choosy one, that's when you get showiness, right? So you can see these males are trying to show off their gene pool. And then, of course, you get the female, not so showy, right? And you see this in mallard ducks. You see this in all sorts of stuff. Now, in Chapter 51, we're going to get more into sexual selection and what causes that to happen. So if we go back to your notes, just to finish up, one question I get asked a lot is why natural selection doesn't produce perfect organisms. So you can look these over. We're going to discuss this more in class, but selection can only act on what's there, so we can't just come up with something out of nothing. It's got to have something to work with, so it's a slow process. Evolution is limited by historical constraints. Once again, it takes a long time to happen. It's only got to be working with what it's got. Another really important one is that adaptations are often compromises, which means that adaptations are going to be things that might be advantageous in one respect, but not advantageous in another. Perfect example is our hands. Our hands are awesome because they're so dexterous and we can pick up little things with them and we can grasp things. However, our hands are so delicate that they break easily, right? You can break a finger pretty easily. So that's kind of a plus and a minus. And then the last is chance. So, you know, the nature is changing all the time, the environment is changing all the time, and so, you know, it's up to chance. So that's chapter 23. Hope you enjoyed it.